Zen at the Sharp End. Welcome to the podcast about how to turn difficult people and relationships into your best teachers. I'm Mark Westmackett, a Zen Buddhist teacher, mindfulness teacher, and ex-professional astronomer. This is a podcast to go along with my book, Zen and the Art of Dealing with Difficult People. In each episode, we'll be exploring different varieties of people, relationships, and situations that we find irritating, difficult, or painful. Together with a number of Zen friends, I'll be discussing how the practices of Buddhism and mindfulness can help us see our difficult people as troublesome Buddhas, our greatest teachers. This podcast is sponsored by Zen Minded. If you get a chance, check them out at www.zenminded.uk. You'll find a curated selection of Japanese homeware and incense, a perfect match to your meditation practice. We're also sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp offers convenient and affordable therapy online. In my opinion, meditation and psychotherapy both offer valuable avenues for exploring our suffering, habits, and stuck areas. A while back I spent 3.5 years meeting twice a week with a psychotherapist when things had become acute, and it felt like the help he gave me was really transformational, especially when supported by my regular meditation practice. If you're interested, they've extended an offer of 10% off your first month of therapy at betterhelp.com/zen at the sharp end. That's betterhelp, HELP.com/zen at the sharp end. In this podcast, I'm speaking to Geshe Namdak, resident teacher at the Jamyang Buddhist Centre in London, UK. Geshe Namdak was born in the Netherlands and found Buddhism through martial arts and a general leaning towards the spiritual perspectives of life. On a work visit to Tibet, he encountered the Tibetan style of Buddhism and felt very much drawn in that direction. He decided to become a monk and then to commit to the 20-year programme of becoming a Geshe. He's now one of just a handful of Westerners to have completed the comprehensive Geshe training curriculum. In this interview, Geshe-la, as he's known, brings his deep wisdom and experience to the discussion of how to deal with difficult people and situations. He describes 4 steps that are critical if we're to transform our impulsive actions into constructive ones: awareness, gaining distance, acceptance, and reflection. And in order that we bring these steps to bear in real life situations, he emphasises the need for cultivating a calm mind. The challenge, of course, is maintaining that clarity when our afflictions, the anger, the hate, etc., are triggered. The danger is that if we don't, we may become emotionally hijacked and lose control of our actions, leading to potentially dire consequences. But he repeatedly emphasises having a clear, accepting mind is not about rolling over and becoming a doormat. We can still be very direct and assertive, even when we're coming from a place of awareness, calmness, and reason. Welcome, Geshe Namdak. Welcome to the Zen at the Sharp End podcast. Great you could be with us today.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, for inviting me and all the things you do for your podcast.
I wonder if perhaps you could start us off by telling us a little bit about your background and your role within your community.
I started in the Netherlands, so to say. I was born in the Netherlands and got my degree in hydrology in the Netherlands from university. And then during that degree, I got more interested in the spiritual aspect of life, so to say. And during one research I did for the government for about a year, an environmental research, then I got more involved in spirituality because I had a background in martial arts. And then from hardcore taekwondo to kung fu and the philosophy behind it, and then into tai chi. And so I moved slowly into more philosophy and got more interested in other aspects of life, so to say, than we commonly strive for. Yeah, so that made me think a bit more about life. I was okay as a student and going to parties and just like anybody else, but then I saw that maybe there's some more sustainable forms of happiness, you could say. So I was a bit looking for that, and then I went to a few different kind of aspects of spirituality or groups, you could say, and then found Buddhism for me personally, of great benefit. So then I started studying Buddhism in the Netherlands. There is a center called Maitreya Institute. And after a little bit over a year, I was quite convinced that this is my path, and decided to go to India to study Tibetan language, because that's the initial tradition I met. The Nalanda tradition, as we call it, preserved in the Tibetan language. And then I decided soon to become a monk and do a traditional way of studies, which is kind of 2 decades of intensive study in South India, in
People
monastery.
think going to university is quite long, but that's
Yeah.
really very in depth. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the 20 years in a monastic environment based on the ancient Nalanda tradition of India has been preserved by the Tibetans, so to say, in the Tibetan language. Yeah, that program is a little bit more intense than an average university program, you could say. Yeah. So yeah, I did it for about more than 2 decades, and then I was invited by one of my main teachers to become the residential teacher in Jamyang. Yeah, so since 2019, I became the resident teacher at Jamyang Buddhist Centre in London.
Yeah, which is just up the road from here, actually.
Oh,
So
is it?
I'm in
Okay.
Camberwell. You're up in Kennington.
Okay.
Yeah,
Close by. Yeah.
and how have you found the contrast? Living in India and coming back to London.
Is different because the monastery I stayed in is kind of quite remote, and it's about 15-20 minutes walk from the forest, with elephants and tigers, and so
Right.
it's quite remote.
Yeah.
And then city London is slightly different, as you know.
Yeah, 15, 20 minutes to a different kind of tiger and elephant.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the whole point of this podcast is really to explore the teaching of difficult people, and how we encounter difficult people, and how that features within our Buddhist practice, and how we come to understand, those encounters as part of our practice, not something to avoid. So, I mean, I wonder if you could cast your mind back, and would there be a point you could remember where that as a concept, people we find difficult are actually people that could teach us about who and what we are, as something arising within your practice?
Yeah. Yeah, as you know, I mean, we cannot escape difficult people, right? If you escape one, then you don't have to worry. Somebody else will pop up very soon. Yeah.
Of course.
So there are various aspects within the Buddhist doctrine, and then it doesn't have to be a kind of religious or faith-based kind of teaching, because we also have secular or universal aspects of Buddhism, as you know. And then we have a topic called mind training, right? So in the mind training, we learn to enhance aspects like practicing patience, for example, and also to see what actually appears to our mind. It doesn't always have to be reality, So how a particular individual appears to us can be completely different as that individual appears to somebody else, right? So you can see that perception is quite subjective. So from that point of view, we can train our mind to see what we think is reality is not always the case. Yeah, our worst enemy, so to say, can be a best friend of somebody else. So that means that just our perception at a particular time, because of certain conditions, makes us believe that's a particular reality, but that's not always the case. And then also, practicing patience, right? That without people, if people always nice to you and praise your ego, so to say, then you never improve, right? If you have people who point out some of your mistakes or wrongdoings, then you can improve yourself and you can become a better human being, right? So in one way, a person who points out your mistakes, we often like to avoid because we don't like that aspect. But it gives us an opportunity to reflect and see if that's true or not, and if so, maybe we should change it and become a better human being. And then on top of that aspect also, we can practice patience, right? To make sure we keep our mind calm, but still can react if needed. Yeah, but react in a way with a calm mind, with a good motivation, and we can still make a decision to say something, right? But it's always much better than to say something when the mind is very irritated, or when the mind is full of anger, so to say. Because when the mind is irritated or full of anger, there's no real clarity of the mind. There's no capacity to reason properly. So you might say the wrong things, right? So there's various aspects we can practice on the cushion in the morning, so to say, and then take that experience throughout the day with being mindful of the insights we got in the morning about our contemplations, about practicing patience, for example. Yeah.
So we take our little mini like examples of real life, which is us on our cushion by ourselves, sitting meditating, and we kind of explore applying that patience and that calmness and that awareness, so that it can then filter out into the larger daily life. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly, because to change the mind, to become a better human being, it depends on a calm mind, first of all. So you have to do some awareness meditation or meditation on the breath, right, to make your mind calm. And then on top of that, also, because when the mind is calm, you be much more aware of these kind of what we call afflictions, of irritations or anger or whatsoever, right? So that you need to have a calm mind, first of all. And then on top of that calm mind, also, you have to get some insights that following the mind of anger or irritation is not always bringing benefit. So, well, on the other hand, if you practice a mind that is calm and practicing patience, you can still say things to a particular individual, like a parent, for example. Yeah, fathers and mothers who have to raise their children. If you're always like a doormat and you let the children do whatever they like, maybe there's not a good outcome. But if you can be quite direct, but inside, if the mind is calm, there's great benefit. But when you get irritated and you start to correct other people, then you have to be careful, because then there's a danger of actually losing the control over the mind, right? So we have to have two aspects. One aspect is the calmness of the mind, so to be aware of the various emotions that play a role in our life. And the other aspect is to reflect and know how to actually transform the mind.
Yeah, so the idea of controlling the mind is an interesting one. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that. I mean, it seems probably from someone from the outside, I could imagine it'd be like, well, is it all about controlling our mind? And also when we're faced with someone who is particularly irritating, or inciting anger in us, that how do we do that? How do we find the calm, patient mind when we're parents? You mentioned parents as parents and or children, right?
Yeah.
Some of the biggest troublesome people we have in our life.
Yeah. I mean, what I said before, the first step is awareness, right? If you build up an awareness, you're more you capable of noticing the very slight differences in your mind. Yeah, you notice the very small kind of irritations. When it blows up, it's often too late. Yeah, it's better go for a walk, or do some exercise, or some social activity to forget it, or
So kind of like take yourself out of the situation,
take a
get some
distance, right?
distance. Yeah.
So if you are more aware of things in your mind, and you have the acceptance that we have these kind of irritations, yeah, we're not perfect human beings, right? So we still have anger in us. But if you have this awareness and you see it coming, and you have the acceptance that this is a kind of negative state of mind or negative thought, then but that by itself already brings a kind of a distance. So as soon as you have that distance, it's much easier not to be overpowered by this particular affliction. Yeah, so that's the first step, so to say, to be aware of the afflictions that come and go, because afflictions in our mind, they come and they're triggered by a person who says something wrong, or an image of a person, or annoying message on WhatsApp, or whatsoever, email, whatsoever, that triggers that, right? So that initial trigger, if you're aware of that aspect, you can prevent that mind from overpowering yourself, from actually what we call an emotional hijack. Yeah, so that's what we have to prevent, right? That's the initial kind of first step. So it's nothing to do with suppressing aspects, but it has to do with being aware, taking distance, having the acceptance, and then walk with it. Then try to see that following this kind of affliction of irritation or anger or hatred, whatever it is not constructive for you, it's not constructive for the conversation, it's not constructive for the other individual. Yeah, so having that insight, then you learn or teach yourself actually how to be more calm in these kind of circumstances. You can still be very direct and say things, but inside there's more peace of mind, and that's a much more constructive way forward, so to say.
Yes, right. So from that point, what you might say or do comes from a place of, as you say, a kind of like awareness and possibly at the root love, really, rather than hatred or anger or something.
Yeah, because the person who is the annoying person, so to say, right? That individual deep inside also wants a peace of mind and wants happiness, right? It's very similar to a person who is drunk. A person who is drunk or on the influence of substances and says something nasty to you, how do you react? You say, yeah, doesn't matter. The person is drunk, right? But a person who is outrageous in a form of anger is very similar. That person deep down below wants to have peace of mind, but is not in control at the time of the anger, right? So in that way, we can even generate kind of compassion for that particular individual, So all our mental and physical aspects or activities are always rooted in a mental attitude, right? So that's, and then you can see then if you have a person who is drunk and a person who is angry, so both produce the same words. But the person who is drunk, you don't get irritated, but the person who is not drunk, you get irritated. But actually the words are exactly the same, right? So but deep down in their minds also they're not in control. So that's why you can look at it from that angle as well, to see. This is not to justify violence or verbal abuse at all. Because if you can do something about it, you should act, right? You should engage in a constructive way forward for helping oneself and others. That's definitely true. But
yes, you can think of many examples where someone is doing something which is intensely irritating and making you angry, and just as you say, like being a doormat is not helpful. Like allowing all this stuff to be, thrown at you or even thrown at someone else is unkind. Yet somehow we need to act from a place of awareness and that calmness.
Yeah, that's very true, because then even you can be very direct. You can be very direct with people, or people. You can correct people, but there's the kind of behind that correction or behind that verbalization of trying to correct a particular individual. There's a positive mind, right? So then the outcome is much better than just fighting against the person who's fighting you. For example. I just told you that in India, I spent about more than 2 decades in South India, and we have a lot of stray dogs, right? It's very interesting. So then you have the territory of the stray dogs, right? So then when a new dog comes in, the group of dogs starts barking at this new dog. And then this new dog also starts to generate fear and irritation, also starts barking. And before you know it, they fight each other. Once we had to help one dog even bite to his own lip, so
Right.
so you can see what anger does, even harm to oneself, and then on another occasion there was also a new dog came into this territory, and the group of dogs starts barking again, but this new dog, instead of getting angry and barking back, he was just wicking his tail, right, and try to play, and all the other dogs in that group didn't know what to do. The dog was reacting completely differently. So they start sniffing him, and within a few minutes, they were playing with each other, right? So you can see that the way we react in a particular situation can have an impact if we have a more positive attitude, and we can change things. Yeah.
That's such a lovely example. Yeah, because that's exactly what happens with groups of humans. Yeah,
Yeah, very similar, isn't it? Yeah.
So I wonder if perhaps there might be, if you have any stories or memories or accounts of where that emotional hijacking you mentioned, like where we basically dysregulate, where we become like taken over, where that has come in, like you've noticed that within yourself, and maybe there's been some sort of shifts in your practice around that. I mean,
you become more aware, I think, over the years, right? To completely give up anger is or to completely transform anger is not an easy task, but over time you become more aware of things. And that's even with criminals. We did some, I mean, criminals is a big word, but it's very true. Even the worst criminal can change. For example, when I was in South India, I was involved in a center, a Buddhist center in Bangalore, which is a big city. And also we engage in a lot of social activity and social services. So we also did things with the Central Prison of Bangalore, which is a prison of 4,000 inmates.
Mm-hmm.
And we went there to give talks, do meditations with the inmates. And our translator, who actually was translating in the local language of Canada, the local language of that state, he was a very nice guy. He was capable of transforming what we were saying into the local language of people who were not very educated in prison, right? Especially on the youngsters. And then once I talked with him and I said, "Why are you in prison?" And then this translator said, "Sorry," he said, "I killed a human being." And he said, "It's very interesting." He said, "For 10, 15 minutes, I was not in control. I made a mistake." So that's what we call an emotional hijack. We can go to the extreme of ending the life of another individual, right? So, but then if you meet this person, he's very incredibly nice and do so much good work for the inmates in prison at the moment. But you can see what the emotional hijack actually can do, right? Yeah.
That's at the sort of extreme, absolutely.
Yeah. But
But
then we have our shorter or shorter term kind of emotional hijack, so to say, when we just lose it and then the clarity of the mind goes, and then you get into a situation you don't like and you like to avoid, but you cannot, so you fight against it. And then you might shout or you might say something wrong, and that the whole thing mostly escalates. It's often not really a very constructive way forward. So that's in that what we call this emotional hijack, or not being in control because of these afflictions or destructive emotions. Then problems arise. So the clue is to be more aware of it and try to transform those aspects. So the awareness comes from concentration meditation, or just simple aspect of counting the breath we could engage in. So you become more aware of what's going on inside the mind. And then on top of that, we try to sit down and analyze that the way, if we just follow these afflictions, then the outcome is not very constructive. But if we keep our mind in a peaceful and patient way, we can still act. We don't have to be like a vegetable, right? We can still take actions and talk with people or be direct in conversations. But inside there's a peace, and then the control remains.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
because
so
we have to start by ourselves, right? As we have one great master in the mind training called Shantideva, one of the great masters of ancient Indian philosophy. And he said, if the whole world is filled with thorns and you cannot walk around without hurting your feet, you can do two things. You can cover the whole world in leather, which is impossible, or you cover your own feet, right? So that means that if you train your own mind, whatever situation you encounter, you will able to deal with. But if you don't train your mind, then you have to do the impossible in preventing these difficulties in life from coming, and that's impossible. Right.
So we're left with no choice but to start with ourselves and to examine who we are and how we see the world and our perceptions, and also, as you say, train ourselves to change those perceptions or to get insights into who and what we are.
Exactly. So and that comes with time, right? So it's like training your mind is not an easy task, so that also we have to have this view that it's going to take time, and when we make a mistake again, acknowledge that mistake and don't get discouraged by it, but learn from it and move forward, rather than just getting discouraged and put it all aside, because then we fall back into old habits again, and then we remain to produce the same pattern as before.
So from your perspective, would you say it's possible to get to the stage where basically you don't get irritated or you don't get frustrated or angry with or indeed you don't sort of end up placating or avoiding anyone that you encounter.
Yeah, I mean, that's possible, but that takes a lot of time and effort in the practice, you know? So initially it will be kind of, in the early days, you might get angry and being disturbed for hours or days, right? And then becomes just 1 hour, and then becomes like a few minutes, and then eventually only a few seconds. So that's possible to the extent that you can completely eliminate anger at the level of nirvana, right? In the Buddhist kind of
Yeah.
training, so to say. But there are very interesting examples of for example, Tibetans in occupied Tibet, in prison after the Chinese occupation, being tortured, and then in that situation, which is extremely difficult physically and mentally, they have trained their mind to such an extent that anger doesn't really rise anymore, even
Mm,
to those who really physically harm. And
mm,
at that time, the thing is, at that time, that you can change that situation, right? If you can change the situation, you should try to act. But if you're in some certain things like that you're in prison and this very very severe kind of forms of torture, etc. Yeah, then you only have your mind left.
mm,
So it's very interesting research being done that the majority of those who come out of these kind of situations, they don't, in this particular Tibetan culture, they don't really show post-traumatic stress disorder. It is very interesting,
huh,
and that is mainly based upon these mind trainings of love and
mm,
kindness and compassion for the Chinese soldiers who also want happiness, don't want suffering, and because of misunderstandings of things, ignorance, they just make all these kind of stupid things or this stupid
mm,
kind of behavior that comes. So and that's science, right? So that's been proven that possibility is there. The power of the mind is quite incredible, actually. Yeah.
absolutely. What we That's very inspirational, isn't it? I mean, I can imagine. I can presume us that they're not really experiencing the trauma in order to have a post-traumatic stress.
Mm.
Like the trauma doesn't really get stuck because they're sort of processing it as they go along and offering this presence and their understanding. I suppose I
Yeah.
could understand it in that
So
sense.
that's very inspiring though, to hear, because a few of my own teachers in the monastery in South India who came from Tibet told me these stories, and you can see there is no who spent like decades in prison in these very difficult circumstances. There's still compassion for each and every sentient being, including the
Mm,
Chinese, which is very
mm,
very impressive. So
mm,
if you see those examples, then you think, wow, this potential of the mind is mind-boggling. Yeah.
mm, mm.
So if that's possible in those severe circumstances, then of course, we ordinary beings on day-to-day life, we should be able to make progress in our relationship with others, right? Yeah.
Mm.
And yeah, you have to put effort. It's like learning a language, right? That when you learn a language, it takes a long time and you don't notice yourself the progress. But the people who know the language you're practicing, if they see you once every few months, they actually come to the conclusion that you are progressing.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
yeah,
Yeah, it's usually your friends or family that tell you that, oh gosh, you're so much calmer, you're so much more tolerant these days.
yeah,
Am I? Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Mm,
So that's
mm.
yeah, that's just a kind of an investment in time, and you have to put effort, because without putting effort, then it's very easy to follow our habituation patterns of the past, right? Yeah.
So some people might say that the anger and the frustration is what motivates us to make the actions. Like I can imagine those situations in the prison and things. You know, your anger at what's being done to you might motivate you later in life to go and you might be let out later and you might, I don't know, start a group or some kind of resistance. But you're saying that we can make those actions without necessarily the motivation of anger.
Hmm. Yeah, you can act, right, like a school teacher or a parent or meeting an annoying person on the street. If you keep your mind calm, you can still show a kind of unpleasant face to a child to make sure that they learn the lesson, right? But
Mm,
that doesn't mean there is anger behind it. That can be even done with compassion for the benefit of the child or
mm,
the person you like to correct. So that's the clue to make sure you act, but you act on a good motivation. Yeah, because it's all, whatever we do physically, verbally, or mentally is always preceded by a mental attitude or a motivation or intention. So if you train your mind in a correct way, then also your physical and verbal behaviors will be what we call virtuous or kind of positive in the way we react to others. But we can still be quite direct. Yeah. I said before, it's not that practicing patience doesn't mean you like a doormat or a vegetable or something like that.
Yeah.
You can be very direct with people, but the motivation behind it is should be pure, right?
Yeah. So that's like making sure we maintain our boundaries.
Yeah.
That the boundaries are secure.
Yeah. And that's also a lot of very interesting scientific evidence proving these points. That there's a scientific project called the Potential Project, who collaborated with Harvard University or Harvard Business Review reports, and they came to the conclusion that a leader in one of the bigger companies, what is a successful leader, is a person who actually has mindfulness, who has compassion, and who is selfless. Which is very, very interesting three pillars. And that's a very solid research of 35,000 kind of interviews. So it's very interesting to see, even on the level of business, as we often think in business you have to be hardcore and like that. But actually, to be really successful on the long term, then it's much better to be emotional intelligent, as we say.
That's right.
Because just a high IQ and being fearful is not going to produce much benefits on the long term. You have to be very emotional intelligent, because you have feeling, other people have feeling, so you have to understand each other to work together.
Yeah, and that includes being able to understand and put yourself in other people's shoes that are being difficult and understand where they're coming from. And as you say, like seeing that sort of care and compassion for all beings in all of that.
Yeah, because when we a bit down, or we in depression, or we have some physical suffering, we always think we're the worst person in the whole planet, or in the whole universe. And then you look at other people, how they actually are suffering much more than us, right? And that by itself gives this clarity to the mind, and this kind of, the distance comes from your problem. If you can take distance from your problems, then you can look at it from a much better angle with clarity, and solve it much better.
Yeah.
And that's true that people, why we engage in holidays or for example extreme sports, is very interesting. People who engage in extreme sports, they get addicted to the extreme sports.
Right.
Why? Because you have to live in the moment.
Yes.
You have to be very aware, and that gives a kick. That gives kind of a blissful mind. Yeah, because for example, if you do extreme sport of free skiing, if you're not in the moment and you hit a tree, that's it, right?
That's it. Yeah.
So living in the moment by itself gives a kind of a clarity to the mind, and gives a kind of happiness to the mind. And because of that, you come back and you can deal with problems much better, because the clarity is there, right?
Yeah. So that the trick then is to learn how to stay present when we're not skiing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that means being aware, where we just started our conversation with. That's the first pillar, to be aware and see what's going on inside your mind. And you learn so much from that by itself, And then with this awareness, you be more calm, and you can take more distance from these afflictions that come up, and then you can work with it much better.
Totally, exactly. And I think when it comes to dealing with people that are difficult, and then we bring our attention within, some people find that extremely uncomfortable and potentially quite painful to look at maybe how they normally are with people, and how people incite certain emotions, and maybe like remembering a time when they have been emotionally hijacked and done something that they regret, and so very, very like uncomfortable sometimes to do that. But then over time we learn to be, I don't know, like more able to do that, with practice.
Yeah, and then try to show some kindness, right, to others. That it's the real enemy is actually within, right? The external enemy is quite easy, because the external enemy, when you show a kind face, or you ask the person when is the right time to talk or to have a drink together, and we can solve the problem. Yeah. the more you give to your inner enemy, the worse they become. Yeah.
Mm,
So
mm,
that's kind of quite clear that the real enemy actually is within, right? Our afflictions, so to say.
mm, mm,
The
mm.
destructive emotions, they are the real cause for suffering. Yeah.
So we learn to see, what you might call learn to see that the Buddha nature, I suppose, of
Yeah, I
our.
mean, there's various other techniques possible as well to see these afflictions by themselves are also just a play of the mind, right? Becoming angry or irritated is just a play of the mind itself. So afflictions or destructive emotions, they come, they abide and disintegrate. You know, we often don't see that aspect. We often see them as very solid,
Aha.
existing there in a permanent, always present way. But that's not the reality. You know, they come, they get triggered, and they abide for some time, and they go again.
Yeah.
So the more you understand that aspect of the afflictions and also or the destructive emotion, you can take more distance from it. You don't get too much involved in it anymore
Right.
because you see it's just a play of the mind, right?
Mm,
Yeah.
mm. Part of the continuous flow of our experience changing.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So
Mm,
that's also one of the reasons why we say that these destructive emotions actually can eventually be taken away or abandoned or eliminated because they're just temporary. They're not always present. And if you play with those causes and conditions, you can transform the mind
yeah.
because these
Yeah.
afflictions they get triggered and they abide for some time and then they go again. So it's all causing conditions they depend upon. So if you play with various types of mind training or more awareness building and then more kind of self-regulation by the power of insight meditations of seeing that these destructive emotions only bring harm rather than benefit, and practicing patience brings more benefit, so you shift your mind and you get this kind of self-regulation that is possible to actually transform your mind. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a beautiful and very inspirational view of where we can go as a human, because
Yeah.
I think so many of us get so stuck in the habitual ways of behaving and feeling like we're kind of that's all there is.
Yeah.
And then hearing from people like yourself who give this very broader, longer view of what can be possible with
Yeah.
the right kind of training and the right kind
Yeah.
of view.
And it is possible for everybody because we all have this potential to change. We all have this potential. You call it Buddha nature, but there's also other forms of potentials. Just why can we change? Even in science, we come to the conclusion of neuroplasticity, right? So
Absolutely.
in Buddhism, we talk about it all the time that you can change your mind to great levels of development. And that's
Mm,
possible if you put some effort. And you can see that these destructive emotions are just cause and effect relations within
mm,
this process of the mind. So if you play with cause and conditions, you can transform, right? Yeah.
mm, mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You can literally create a new mind.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. It's like you could say like the clouds, especially in the UK. I lived here for a long time in South India where you mostly have blue sky, like
Oh,
24/7.
right.
Yeah. But here in the UK, you have always over. Yeah. So
Normal clouds. Yeah.
yeah. So the clouds basically they obscure the blue sky, right? But the blue sky is still there. So that's for our mind exactly the same. The
Mm,
clarity of the mind is basically always present. Maybe sometimes it's more dormant, but with these destructive emotions, it's like these clouds, right? They're just temporarily obscure, but sometimes the clouds go, and there's the clarity of the mind, right? So, the more you get actually, you activate this kind of calmness or blue sky kind of clarity of the mind, then these clouds will have less influence, right? If
mm,
you in
mm,
the blue sky itself, although the clouds are there below, they don't influence you anymore, right?
mm,
So that's kind of another kind of example you could say to actually see the possibility or the potential of the mind. If you abide in this clarity, if you abide in this calmness, then these afflictions they don't really influence you that as before.
And we can handle more difficult situations and still remain in that clarity. Like we get better practiced at being able to remain in that clarity and awareness when things really, really, when this person is extremely difficult or
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, because if you keep yourself calm, you prevent the irritation from coming,
Mm,
right? And then you can even help the person because you're much calmer. You have a much
mm,
clearer
mm,
overview of the whole situation. Maybe you have to wait a little bit till the anger settles down of that individual, but just showing not a reaction of anger towards that person, that by itself will show that person already kind of breaking that ice of this irritation. Yeah.
Like the dog in the pack,
exactly,
right?
like the dog example. Yeah, in I mentioned South India.
Yeah. Oh well, I mean that's lovely. I mean that would be a lovely place to stop. I think we touched on a lot of different topics there, and such a great wisdom and experience from yourself. Thank you so much for bringing that.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, for all your good work you do with your podcast and helping people to understand the mind a little better and how to deal with these kind of difficulties in life. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review and a star rating on whatever platform you use. And do recommend it to others, because we all meet difficult people, and each of those meetings presents an opportunity for learning and growth. I also have a downloadable video course in how to deal with difficult people. Head over to my website for more information, markwestmaquette.co.uk. Thanks for listening.